The table was set for 20, and I had brought the wine. That detail matters, though no one seemed to notice at the time. I had driven 40 minutes to my parents' house in Deerfield with a case of Côtes du Rhône, a dish of roasted vegetables for my nephew, and a casserole my mother had specifically requested. The kitchen smelled like it always did at Easter: garlic, good bread, the faint warmth of old radiators. Cousins moved between rooms. My father stood at the head of the table in the collared shirt he only wore for occasions he considered important. My mother had that particular brightness in her eyes that meant she had been saving something to say all day. She stood up before the second course. She clinked her glass with a butter knife, waited for the room to settle, and announced that the entire family, flights, hotel, everything was going to Nice in July for Celeste's wedding. The table erupted. My aunt pressed her hands together. My uncle laughed and said something about French wine. Celeste, sitting 3 chairs from me, lifted her chin the way she always did when the room was hers. She was 32, radiant, and entirely accustomed to this. My mother sat back down looking as though she had personally commissioned the Mediterranean. I waited for the natural pause in the applause and asked what weekend the ceremony was. My mother glanced at me. Not with hostility exactly, more with the mild impatience of someone asked an irrelevant question. "Oh, sweetheart," she said. "You won't be coming." "Marcus needs someone at home," she said it pleasantly, the way you'd explain to a child why they couldn't stay up late. Then she turned back to Celeste, and the conversation resumed around me as if nothing had happened. I picked up my fork and kept eating. To understand why that moment landed the way it did, you'd need to understand what our family had quietly organized itself around for the better part of a decade. Celeste was the one our parents had bet on. She had moved to Charleston at 24 for a culinary arts program, then pivoted to event design, then pivoted again to something she described as experiential hospitality consulting. Each reinvention arrived with its own financial support: tuition, deposits, a car when hers broke down in South Carolina, a bridge loan once when a business venture stalled. My parents never discussed these transfers at the table. They were simply things that happened because Celeste needed them to happen. I had a different function. I was the one who worked steadily, who answered calls at inconvenient hours, who had the kind of job, healthcare contract administration, that made me useful in practical ways most of my family couldn't fully define, but instinctively relied on. When my parents were stretched thin 7 years ago after my father's small consulting firm lost its anchor client, I built a dedicated savings and investment account, contributed to it consistently, and gave my parents authorized access so they could draw on it during emergencies without the friction of asking me each time. It was a structural solution to a structural problem. That was how I thought about things. The account had been useful. It covered a roof replacement, a medical bill my father's insurance underpaid, a semester of private tutoring for a younger cousin. Over time, my parents began speaking about it the way people speak about inherited furniture, as though it had always existed, as though it belonged to the house. They started referring to it as the family account. Vacations came out of it. Celeste's venue deposit for the Nice wedding had come out of it. The hotel block for 14 family members had been reserved against it. What they never revisited, because it had never seemed to matter, was whose name was on the account. Mine. Only mine. The authorized access I had extended to my parents was exactly that, an authorization revocable at any time through the bank's standard process. I had never removed it because I had never needed to. Until that evening in April, surrounded by 20 relatives eating Easter lamb, when my mother explained with a light smile that I would not be attending my sister's wedding because someone had to stay home with my son. I let the table fill back up with conversation before I said anything. Celeste was describing the venue. A restored estate outside Nice with a courtyard and a view of the hills. My father was nodding with the satisfied look of a man who believed he had planned wisely. My mother refilled her glass. I waited until there was a natural lull, then asked, conversationally, whether anyone had a current sense of what the total trip budget looked like. My father named a figure. It was substantial. I nodded. "That's all coming out of the investment account?" I asked. "It's already sorted," my mother said, with a tone that closed the subject. I reached into my pocket, unlocked my phone, and opened my banking application. "I want to make sure you have what you need," I said. "Because there's something about that account you should probably understand." I looked at my father. "It's in my name. You have authorized access. That access can be modified." My father frowned. "Renata, what are you doing?" I tapped the screen twice. The authorization removal took less than 10 seconds to process. I set the phone face down on the table. My mother's phone buzzed first. Then my father's. Celeste looked between them, confused. My mother picked up her phone, read the notification, and went very still. My father read his and looked up at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not anger, not yet, but something closer to vertigo. "That's a banking alert," I said. "Authorized access has been removed." Celeste put her glass down. "What does that mean?" "It means the account paying for the flights, the hotel, and the venue deposit is no longer accessible to anyone but me." The silence that followed was different from the silence after my mother's announcement. That one had been uncomfortable. This one had weight. Celeste's voice went high and sharp. "You need to fix that right now." "I don't actually." My father stood halfway from his chair. "This is not the time." "I know," I said. "You made that clear earlier." "I'm not part of this trip." "I understand that now." I looked at my mother, then at Celeste, then back at my father. "I'm just making sure the finances reflect the guest list." I stood up. I folded my napkin and set it beside my plate the way my mother had taught me when I was 7. I took my jacket from the back of the chair. Celeste said something else, her voice climbing, but I was already moving toward the door, and the words dissolved behind me into the general sound of the table breaking apart. The air outside was cool and very quiet. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, not thinking about much. Then I drove home. The calls started the next morning and didn't stop for 2 weeks. My sister left voicemails that oscillated between fury and something that sounded like grief but never quite became an apology. My mother sent messages about family and forgiveness and the importance of not letting pride destroy relationships. My father tried a more pragmatic approach, pointing out that refundable deposits had already been lost. None of them, in any message, in any medium, acknowledged what had been said to me at that table. Without the account, the nice wedding ceased to exist. The venue cancellation forfeited a deposit. The hotel block was released. What eventually happened, months later, was a small ceremony at a banquet hall in town, attended by perhaps 30 people. I was not among them. I sent a card. I also, for the first time in 7 years, stopped supplementing my family's finances in any form. The remarkable thing was how little chaos followed. No crisis materialized that I was needed to solve. The emergencies that had always seemed to require my involvement simply stopped arriving, the way houseguests stop appearing when you stop leaving the door unlocked. My life became, in the most ordinary sense, mine. I made decisions about money with only my son and myself in mind. I started a savings account with a single authorized user, myself. I saw a therapist for a while. She never used words like toxic or boundaries, which I appreciated. She mostly asked questions and waited. One afternoon she asked me whether I thought I had been trying to purchase belonging, and I said I wasn't sure, but I thought I might have been trying to prove that I deserved it. She nodded like that was a useful distinction. I'm still working out whether it is. There are people who will read this and say I overreacted, that a single careless comment at a holiday dinner wasn't worth the fallout. Maybe. But I had been the invisible architecture of that family for a long time, the load-bearing wall everyone walked past without looking at. The comment at Easter wasn't the wound. It was just the moment I finally understood where I stood. I don't think about nice anymore. I think about the drive home that night and how quiet the highway was, and how I turned the radio off, because the silence felt like something I had earned. Have you ever been the person everyone counts on, right up until the moment you're no longer convenient, and if so, did you decide that was enough or did you keep showing up anyway?